How's it going, everybody? This is Travis Platt Reviews, and during this time of isolation, I really had the time to sit down and think about one of my favorite genres, pop punk, and how it seems to be dying. Or is it? Today we're going to talk about the rise and fall of pop punk. If you're new to the channel, thank you so much for watching. I do album reviews, lo-fi edits, and topic videos, so if you like what you hear, go ahead and click that subscribe button, click the like button, and comment below. Also, this is the first video where I ask the opinion of fans of the channel and fans of the genre their thoughts, and they will be included in the video here. And if you'd like to be included in the next topic, go ahead and follow Travis Platt Reviews on Facebook or Instagram. Links will be in the description below. So, let's hop into it. Pop punk is defined as a genre with the distortion and heavy guitars from punk bands of the 1970s, but with the choruses and hooks of pop artists. The Ramones are considered the founders of the genre, but bands like the Buzzcocks and the Undertones also contributed to the creation of a new genre. During the mid-1990s, after the grunge movement, bands like Green Day and the Offspring exploded and contributed to the peak of pop punk, which lasted from the late 90s to the mid-2000s. TRL on MTV contributed to the peak of pop punk, constantly playing bands like Blink-182, Good Charlotte, and Sum 41 on their show. These bands were commonly fun-loving and talked about girls and partying. These bands were commonly used in video game soundtracks like the Tony Hawk games or various baseball and football games. By the mid-2000s, the rise of the mall emo scene catapulted pop punk, with the rise of Fall Out Boy, Simple Plan, Paramore, and more. These bands are a lot of who people my age still consider the definitive pop punk. This fusion of pop punk and the emo scene is still seen to this very day. This style also divided the emo world, clashing the mall emo bands from the real emo bands. When in reality, you can listen to both styles without committing blasphemy. This era of pop punk arguably had the most Billboard and radio success. The All-American Rejects, the Red Jumpsuit Apparatus, and Avril Lavigne all had Billboard Top 15 songs, and this genre was all over the place. Towards the end of the 2000s, neo-pop punk started to get popular, with bands like All Time Low, The Maine, and Boys Like Girls that used synths and bright imagery. This also was the less heavy version of electronic horror, which is one of my personal favorite subgenres. If you'd like me to make a video on that, go ahead and comment below. In the early 2010s, pop punk was declining. Bands like Fall Out Boy and Paramore changed their sound to something more pop-friendly, and many bands disbanded, and the scene was no longer headlining major festivals. This is probably the first place to look at the decline of pop punk, but in the year 2010, a revival was already in the works by a band called The Wonder Years and their album The Upsides. This album jump-started an entire new wave of pop punk, having a less radio-friendly style compared to its predecessors, and having influence in emo and indie, and had a much more mature subject matter. Bands started emerging out of everywhere from the early to mid-2010s. Bands such as The Story So Far, Neck Deep, Knuckle Puck, Real Friends, and more were all releasing a new style of music from 2010 to 2014, and pop punk is back, but in a new way. All of these bands would tour together, and all continued to become successful. The Story So Far's first two albums, Under Soil and Dirt and What You Don't See, which came out in 2011 and 2013, cemented their names in pop punk. Neck Deep's second album, Life's Not Out to Get You, which released in 2015, is regarded as one of the best pop punk albums of all time. And this genre's rise on the social media website Tumblr caused it to blow up even more, creating an infamous aesthetic and fashion. There was also a subgenre of pop punk inspired indie emo bands, like Modern Baseball, The Front Bottoms, Citizen, Basement, and Turnover, that were heavily associated in the pop punk scene, despite having a different sound. But during the late 2010s, the majority of these new pop punk bands either disbanded or changed their sound, and those that didn't fell into obscurity. So what caused this genre to die off so quickly? Let's take a look at bands that were in this pop punk wave that have changed dramatically since. And for a disclaimer, I'm in no way saying that these bands have gotten worse over time. Change is inevitable, and it's a way to evolve as a musician and as a group. Story So Far is the biggest example, being a band that were known for being one of the most aggressive bands in the genre. But their 2018 album Proper Dose was released, and had a much more indie pop direction, using a lot more synths and simplistic drum patterns. And vocalist Parker Cannon is no longer aggressively yelling into a field, but is instead, singing happily in a field. Grayscale even more so went into an indie pop direction with their 2019 album Nella Vita. The band's debut full-length Adornment, which came out in 2017, which was their breakthrough album, which had a mix of angst and maturity, and is a very definitive sound for modern pop punk. But when the singles for Nella Vita came out 2 years later, the presence of the guitar and the angst most known was completely gone, and was being replaced by synths and keyboards and processed drum work, and the vocals are much softer and cleaner in comparison. Nella Vita is a pop album from beginning to end. Neck Deep is also seeming to go in this direction with their upcoming album All Distortions Are Intentional, which has not been released as of recording, but the singles, especially Low Life, prove that the aggression and raw instrumentation is very much gone. On the opposite side of the spectrum, Can't Swim slowly but surely left their pop-punk roots, and their 2019 EP Foreign Language is primarily a post-hardcore release, with a lot of breakdowns, aggression, and unclean vocals. This release was a polarizing change to the band's sound, but fans were very on board with it, and tours with A Day to Remember and Counterparts followed. Oh God, I always felt like you were such a stranger. Boston Manor, who started as a pop-punk band from their debut EPs Driftwood and Sodade, and their debut album Be Nothing. But their sophomore album, Welcome to the Neighborhood, changed everything, and they took influence from alternative rock and grunge, having them experiment with the mix and heavy muffled distortion. Heart Attack Man and Microwave, both indie emo bands that had influence in pop punk, abandoned those roots with their 2019 albums Fake Blood and Death is a Warm Blanket, both becoming much heavier with influence from hardcore. These three bands all toured together in late 2019 and are creating a new genre, which is coined by Eric of Heart Attack Man as evil pop punk, or as I like to call it, post-pop punk. So, why are so many bands drifting away from pop punk? So, the question is, did pop punk die? In the mainstream, absolutely. The mainstream media has very much pushed their focus to rap and dance music, as said by Eli Clevenger. The world of music has ultimately shifted and wanted a new flavor in other genres, and younger people today are more interested in rap and pop music. Even looking at the alternative music scene itself, emo rap artists are filling the gap that pop punk bands held a decade ago. And Garden and Convolk are bigger in Spotify listeners than Neck Deep and The Story So Far. But this doesn't mean the genre is completely gone. The bands that have made the genre popular and revived it may have changed, but there are still bands that are continuing to lead the charge. As said by Cassie Martins, bands like With Confidence, State Champs, and others are still very relevant with that pop-punk sound. And although they are very much more like pop bands now to me personally, All Time Low and Water Parks still have their roots in pop-punk and still have their fan bases who love the genre, even if the bands are experimenting with other styles now, especially Water Parks with a more rap and electronic pop influenced sound. One thing that could have caused pop punk to fade in popularity are the common stereotypes of hating your town and loving your friends, as Alex Aris says. The pop punk genre as a whole has been stagnant and generic, so bands seem to want to leave the genre and innovate elsewhere, which is why I think so many bands are playing other styles of music. the backwards hat, khaki short wearing whiny vocalist got old quickly, and people wanted a new flavor. And a new flavor of pop punk is starting to emerge. Certain bands are using trap beats and rap influence in pop punk, as Wes Papes says. Belmont is leading a charge for a new wave. Another bands in this style that I personally love is Magnolia Park, Crooked Teeth, and Carousel Kings, the latter evolving from an easycore band and adapting their style to what is relevant. And there are still pop punk and emo influenced hybrid bands around, like there were 5 years ago. But as Kelsey Danner says, the line between pop punk and emo is becoming more and more blurred. Turnover was a band she mentioned that shifted their sound, originally starting as a pop punk band in their self-titled EP and slowly transitioned to a post-grunge style and eventually a dream pop rock sound, which is where they reached their popularity. But that doesn't devalue that the emo and pop punk bands are still around. Youth Fountain is a big name for sure leading this charge, and they have been around for only a few years. Even Sum 41, who were one of the major pop punk bands of the early 2000s, implemented their older hits with their newer, heavier sound, as Mark Irwin says, and it's becoming common that non-pop punk artists are releasing pop punk songs. Like Machine Gun Kelly, Nothing Nowhere, and Family Pet have all done pop punk songs and albums, and have shown their inspiration from the scene, while also contributing to the evolution of the genre. In conclusion, pop punk may have declined over the years, but there is still a place for the genre, and pop punk groups on Facebook are still extremely big and active, and so many pop punk bands are still coming out of nowhere, but it may never reach the relevance it did 15 years ago, and that's not a bad thing. Just like Midwest emo, these genres hold a special place in the hearts of the fans that love it, and these cult fan bases will keep the genres alive for many years to come. Thanks for watching.